I do want to start off with a celebration. I think you should feel good about yourselves. So I want to repeat something that I did 4 years ago. I want to run through some different genres of American music, which we all know to be Southern music. It's time to feel superior over the Yankees, because this is one area in which we thoroughly have whipped the Yankees. They stand no chance against us in music. They have no musical culture of their own. And if they did, they would have shoved it down our throats a long time ago, and there would be no Southern music. But they have no answer to this. I'd like to point out that things have gotten worse for the Yankees since I did this 4 years ago, because I've gotten some very insightful suggestions from some people, and I've added some things. Now, admittedly, not all of us are going to like all of these different genres of music that I'm about to run through. However, as Dr. Roberts pointed out, we are a dichotomous people. We are perfectly capable of not supporting something and yet proudly promoting it all at the same time, because we are Southern. So, how many of these styles do you know? Can you hear?
Will make you don't let your baby grow up. Take me right back to the track, Jack. Choo choo, choo choo, choo, woo woo, woo woo, choo choo choo. Choo choo choo, take me right back to the track, Jack. I guess if you said so, I'll have to pack the things and go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You got me doing what you want me. I believe you're doing me wrong, and now I know. I believe you're doing me wrong, now I know. The Texas Playboys are on the end. Where the rain never falls and the sun never shines, where it's dark as a dungeon way down in the mine.
Yeah. answer was Carl.
All counties mostly.
Carry it home in a turkey sack, goat salad and Precious nuts, she wasn't out of the eye like a feather when she walks away. She turned me on like a pickup truck out like a devil when she wow. Thank God for mom and dad was into together, but we don't know how. Yo, get back now! Yo, get back now! Yo, get back now! Back it now! Take for the money! Bounce to the floor! Toot it up! Hot, hot, girl, let's go! Yeah, baby, this is how we roll. We rolling in town with nothing else to do but take another lap. We're standing away again in Margarita.
Real Alabama.
A mi mente puedes hablar y estaré contigo cuando triste estar. Quise que se la conserva
All right. What do they all have in common? I hope to make the list get even bigger as time goes on. But of course, what do they all have in common? Here, right? All right here from Dixie. All of those styles came from Dixie. The key thing about those styles, something I'm going to talk about a little later today, is the blend. With the exception of Sacred Harp, I think Sacred Harp is the only one of those styles that is unique and homogeneous. All of the rest of them are blends. They are taking other styles and mixing them together, throwing into a pot of gumbo, and you get a new style. And it's one thing that we're incredibly good at in the South, and it's the one thing Yankees cannot do to save their lives is blend things together, because their only outlook is to conquer things, eliminate things, eradicate things, cancel things. They have no idea how to blend things, and we are really, really good at that. I do admit that there is some of my northern friends, when they see this, they're a little dismayed. It depresses them a little bit, and they really have no answer for it. And they sometimes they'll come up with something. If they can think of one style that's northern, then that'll throw my whole argument off, and they'll say something like, what about Tin Pan Alley? Tin Pan Alley, that's from New York. I say, yeah, you're right. Tin Pan Alley is from New York. Now give me about 30 others and we'll have a conversation. And my Midwestern friends always love to go, polka! Polka! Don't forget the polka! Except polka's not yours. Polka comes from Bohemia. It does not come from Wisconsin. I will admit there is a jaw-dropping amount of incredibly great Western culture music that comes from Europe, especially Germany, Austria, and Italy. And it came to America in waves of immigration. The way the music was treated, the way it was handled once it got here is very telling, because music that landed in the Northeast, music that landed in the Midwest from Europe, stayed that way. It stayed the same way. If you go to Iowa and listen to a band play, you're going to hear authentic German music coming from a band in Iowa. But if you hear German music coming from Louisiana, it's because you're listening to Cajun music. Cajun takes that German music and mixes it. Tejano music takes that German and mixes it. You don't hear authentic German music coming out of Louisiana. You hear something else. You hear a blend, and that's what we do. That's what we're the best at doing, is blending our styles. So here's the dilemma. On the one hand, we've got the English Cavaliers, who were a lighthearted, spirited, fun-loving bunch. They were highly sophisticated, highly well-educated, well-trained in music. All of the Cavaliers who came to Jamestown Colony would have brought with them their own personal musical instrument. It might have been something like a string instrument or a woodwind instrument. And there were definitely trumpets on their ships, but they would have brought instruments with them. They would have been very capable of playing those instruments. The Cavaliers loved to make music, and they also loved listening to the Indian music. The Puritans that they encountered had their own musical traditions and cultures, and the Cavaliers were interested. They were fascinated by what they heard. They attempted to draw connections between their own music and what they were hearing the Indians do. They enjoyed celebrating with their native counterparts. They enjoyed the ceremonies. They took the time to learn how to make the instruments. They wrote prolifically about their experiences playing music with the Indians. On the other hand, I forgot. Dr. Roberts inspired me. He had his 4 U's, so I've got my 4 C's here. So the Cavaliers in Virginia represent 2 of my C's, cooperation and collaboration. And then on the other hand, we've got the Puritans in New England. 1630 Salem, witch trials, that whole bunch. And they were not interested in learning anything about the Indian culture. They were interested in converting to Christianity. Now, of course, so were the Jamestown colonists, but just not as severely. But at least Indians got a better deal from the Puritans than they did from the Quakers, who just wanted to eliminate them completely. But the Puritans tried to convert them to Christianity and teach them their own psalm singing. They sang psalms from a psaltery, and they tried to teach the Indians how to do that, which meant that the Indians were forbidden from making their own music in the vicinity of the Puritans. They could not make their own music. And so the 2 C words that go with the Puritans are going to be conquer and cancel. That was their way of dealing with the natives. So from this, we are told that our American musical heritage and history and culture comes from the Puritans, not the Southerners. Anybody who believes that is going to have to be utterly confused by the way that I started this whole presentation. How did that happen? How did the South get all of this music if American musical heritage comes from the Puritans to start with? The colonists at Jamestown loved to blend sounds. The colonists at Salem did not. Now, when I was in school, I got a PhD from Auburn, and as part of my graduate courses, I took a lot of courses in music history of America and courses in music education in America. And all of my courses taught me that I should be ashamed of myself being from the South, that the South had no contribution to musical history in America. Everything came from New England, especially Boston. Boston was the center of the universe as far as all of my textbooks were concerned. All of my professors were good Southern professors. I took my classes in Alabama, and most of my fellow students were Southern, and we were all taught the same thing, that music in America comes from New England, period. No discussion. And as I got older, I realized that my instructors, my professors, were taught that way when they were younger. That's the way they were taught. So that's why they taught me that way. And I'm very sad to say, my first couple of years as a college instructor, I did the exact same thing. I repeated that myth to my students, for which I am forever regretful for doing that, because it didn't make any sense. I didn't understand how I could play such great music on my own that came from the South, but yet I was telling my own students, music doesn't come from the South. Just forget that. Forget it. We won't even talk about the South. This is one of the textbooks that I used when I was in college. The author, H. Wiley Hitchcock, is from New York. Notice a trend that's going to start here. And Music in the United States, a historical introduction. Jamestown is mentioned on page 1 of the introduction, and the only mention it gets is to say that Jamestown did nothing of any consequence in music. So we can just skip right past it and go to the Puritans. The first time the South is mentioned anywhere in this textbook is in chapter 5 when they get up to 1820. That's the first time any Southern music is mentioned in this history of music in the United States. And it has to do with blackface, minstrelsy, and Jim Crow. The chapter somehow leaves out the part, though, that the Jim Crow character was created by a New Yorker. Interesting how that works out. That is not just a cherry-picked incident. This is considered to be the very first music history textbook in America written by a Frenchman, Frederick Louis Ritter. Music in America is the one that began this myth about music coming from New England. And it does, again, mention Jamestown, but only to say that nothing important came out of Jamestown. Everything came out of New England. 20 years later, this author, Louis Ellison, in History of American Music, repeated the same myth, that Jamestown was chronologically first, but no music of any consequence came out of that experience. The next textbook, I'm just going to let you read the title for yourself and see if you can see a problem here. Comprehensive, right? It doesn't even start until 1620. It leaves out how could you be comprehensive if you leave out 13 years before 1620? Keep in mind the rules for cultural significance. All of these authors, except for the Frenchman, were New England authors. The rules for cultural significance in America were created by New Englanders. And oddly enough, they took whatever happened in New England as the way it's supposed to be. Now, it's funny how that works out. So they wrote the textbooks, they got to set the rules. And us Southerners know how that works. Two huge problems come from this. If you follow that logic, then you have one problem of Eurocentrism. The music that was coming out of New England, as I mentioned, was basically just regurgitated European music. The Puritans sang the same psalm tunes that they'd sung in England, the exact same ones. They created a new psalm book in Cambridge, and it was the Bay Psalm book. It was the first book printed in America in 1640, and it was a psalm book. And it was basically just English psalm tunes from the book of David that they had learned back in England, and they just added more of them to the Psalter that they had. But it was nothing new. It was just a regurgitation of European English psalm tunes. Captain John Smith was definitely an entrepreneur and definitely a little bit of a little rough on the Indians, but he had his love of music. He wrote prolifically about the Indians, their instruments. He loved the way they constructed the instruments. He wrote about it. He wrote about the sounds of the drums. He wrote about the voices of the Indians, their vocal ranges. He wrote about their harmonies. And one of the colonists, Henry Spellman, wrote about interpreting Indian music in terms of harmony, in terms of form, in terms of melody, in terms of instrumentation, and comparing that to the English music that they brought with them, and which enabled them to make the hybrid music that I've talked about. They were invited by the Indians to participate in their ceremonies, and they did so willingly. One of the colonists wrote that it seems like all we do every night is just sit around and drink, smoke, sing, and dance. And I can't think of a better way to describe Southerners than that right there. I understand there's some complaints last night about people around here just drinking, smoking, singing, and dancing right outside to the wee hours. The Puritans, by comparison, not only disdained the culture of the Massachusetts tribe, as I mentioned, they forbid them from making their own music. They tried to convert them to Christianity, and any conversion means they have to give up their native music in favor of the European model. And so the problem of Eurocentrism in New England music is that it is just a regurgitation of European music. It's nothing new. It seems odd to me to base a history of American music on something that is just Europe all over again. What was coming out of Virginia was something new, something really new. Did they write it down? No, they didn't write down a single piece of their music. We have no clue what their music sounded like other than their descriptions of the music. That's the point that the historians like to make, that, well, since they didn't write it down, it doesn't count. Can you point to any music that they created? No, I can't. But I know it's there because of the way I started this presentation. That's how I know that music was there. They blended the same way we've been doing it ever since. The other problem is chronology. I mean, 1607 is clearly before 1620 and 1630, so chronology wins. Another problem of the chronology that I learned, I did not know this until I started to prepare for this, is that the very first opera of any kind performed in the Americas was not performed in Boston or New York or Philadelphia. Anybody want to guess where the very first opera was performed in the Americas?
Charleston.
It absolutely right, in Charleston. Charleston had the first opera. And it wasn't just a one and done opera, it was a season. Charleston was the first city in America to set up an opera season of recurring shows and recurring seasons after that. I've worked in musical theater. I have worked in opera. You do not put on an opera in a show where nobody's going to show up. You put it where you know it's going to be successful and it's going to sell out. And so that raises an interesting question. If the South is bleak and dreary in terms of musical culture, how do you get an opera? How do you get an opera season? Clearly, there was some quality music going on in and around Charleston for quite some time before that opera appeared. Oh, by the way, it's just, if you're on a trivia team, the opera was called Flora, and the composer was John Hippisley. He was not famous, and the opera itself was not famous, but it counts as the first, so there you go. Even as the decades passed, as travelers to Jamestown came in the late 17th century and into the early 18th century, their writings continue to confirm those of John Smith and the other original colonists. That not only were they blending music with the Indians, but they were allowing the Indians to keep their music intact as it was. They were not erasing and eradicating Indian culture. They were allowing them to continue to make music the way they wanted to make it. Travelers from New England to Virginia were warned about this abomination, this situation that was going on in Virginia, where the colonists and the Indians are collaborating with each other. They are coexisting with each other, and you need to be aware of that, and you need to be careful about that. And the Union troops would have that same experience in 1862 when they decided to show up and find blacks and whites living and working together perfectly fine and harmoniously. They thought that was an abomination too. But the New England colonists found the same thing in Jamestown. Why were they coming here? Why were New England colonists just dropping by Virginia? Well, the controlling boards of both Massachusetts Bay Company and the Chesapeake Bay Company, both of them were Puritans. Jamestown was a Puritan colony, and it had a Puritan reverend. Reverend Hunt was a sort of a progressive, not anything like Cotton Mather. He was a little bit of a progressive minister. He invited the Indians into the Puritan worship services in Jamestown. He allowed them not only to attend, but to participate. And he allowed them to add their own chants. Whenever an English psalm tune was performed as part of the worship service, he allowed the Indians to conclude it with some of their own chants. I can't even begin to imagine how wondrous that must have sounded with an English psalm tune followed up with a little coda provided by English Indian chanting. That must have been amazingly fantastic. And you can't even begin to imagine something like that happening in New England, of Indians being invited in, much less invited to participate. So what's the difference? How is it so different between New England and here. And the difference, as Dr. Roberts pointed out a couple of days ago, the difference is culture. We have it, they don't. I mean, I don't know how to make it any more simple than that. Southerners are naturally mistrustful of Yankees because we see them as money grubbing. Everything is about bank accounts and money and profit to them, and we're not that way. And they see us through their lens of economics, and to them, we look poor. We're lazy, poor, destitute, because we are not in constant pursuit of that bank account. So when you look at both cultures through the lens of the other culture, then that's why you see that difference. They see us as poor because we don't have fat bank accounts. We see them as poor because they don't have the things that we have, the wonderful things that we have. Take a look at this picture. Southerners are rich. We are wealthy in culture. We are wealthy in family. Southerners are wealthy in food. Think about our food versus their food. It's not even close to a comparison. Southerners are wealthy in land. We love the land. We write songs about the land constantly. We write poetry about the land, paintings about the land. Southerners are wealthy in faith. Southerners are wealthy in community. Southerners are wealthy in literature, and Southerners are wealthy in music. In turn, when you look at the North through our lens, then it looks pretty bleak and desperate up there. Remember the old Bugs Bunny cartoons where Bugs would cross the Mason-Dixon line, and north of the Mason-Dixon line it was all gray and desolate, and south of the Mason-Dixon line it was all lush and green and wonderful and birds singing. And I grew up with that impression in my head, and the older I get, the more I realize Bugs Bunny was right on the dot with that thing. He had that exactly right. Culture is something that you can't invade, you can't occupy it, you can't breed it out, you can't bankrupt it. It's here. We have our culture. It's still here. After 160 years of focused genocide on our culture, we still have it. And you can't imagine how infuriating that must be to Yankees every time they hear Southern music, because this is us rubbing their faces right in it. Thank you for letting me talk to you today. I appreciate the honor of standing in front of you and talking about music.